After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
When Donald Trump signed a package of tariffs targeting Europe, he did not expect the response to be so precise, harsh, and unexpectedly swift. While the White House was trying to impose its economic agenda on the world, Germany, France, and even small but determined Denmark were quietly but consistently putting together their own plan. A plan that today threatens to paralyze an entire industry, the American auto industry.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
This is not just another round of trade disputes. It is a systemic attack on the very essence of what has been considered unshakable for decades. The U.S. auto industry, valued at $1.5 trillion, 0 cents, may have seemed indestructible, but today it is forced to play by someone else's rules and on someone else's turf. By combining environmental standards, protectionist policies, and strategic thinking, Europe has struck a blow not against individual companies, it has struck at the very logic of American export power.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
France is introducing new taxes on gasoline and diesel cars. Germany has practically declared internal combustion engines obsolete and is preparing to phase them out of the market. And Denmark, which until recently was seen as a peripheral player, is pushing aggressive initiatives to completely decarbonize transport within the EU. For American cars, traditionally renowned for their size, power, and emissions, this means one thing: they are no longer welcome. While American companies are looking for loopholes, Trump is at a loss. Everything he has been counting on, pressure, the threat of tariffs, energy superiority, has suddenly proved useless. The environmental agenda in Europe is not just a trend. It is an ideology, a strategic line, and at the same time, an economic filter that the American auto industry can no longer pass through.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe, and then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
But is everything so clear-cut? Who actually started this economic duel? Are Europe's actions motivated by concern for the environment, or are they well-disguised economic nationalism? And can Trump now strike back if his own industry is already on the verge of technological backwardness?
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
In this issue, we explain why the actions of 3 European countries could be a turning point for the entire US economy, who is really winning this game, and why the future of General Motors, Ford, and dozens of auto parts suppliers depends not only on innovation, but also on diplomacy. Tune in. Ahead is a story about how Europe hit the export brake and forced the US to rethink everything it has believed in for the last 100 years. When Donald Trump once again declared unfair trade relations with Europe and promised to impose tariffs on car imports, his team did not seem to fully understand the backlash this could provoke. The first consequences were almost imperceptible. At first glance, the statistics remained within normal limits, but beneath the calm surface, a process was unfolding that threatened to undermine the foundations of the American export economy. The automotive industry is in the spotlight. The biggest players, Germany, France, and Denmark, have launched a whole series of measures that are already creating almost insurmountable barriers for the US. Whereas America used to rely on its volume and scale, the situation is now changing rapidly. This time, the rules are being dictated by another continent.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
At first glance, it all started with the tightening of environmental standards in the EU. Germany was the first to take radical measures. As early as 2023, a law was signed there effectively banning the registration of new cars with internal combustion engines after 2030. However, few people knew that this law was accompanied by another initiative, the Priority Access Program, which provided EU companies with quotas for the delivery of electric vehicles without duties, while products from the US had to undergo additional certification procedures. This meant not only delays, but also higher production costs. American companies lost up to 17% of their margin on each export unit, according to internal estimates by the US Auto Global Consortium.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
France took a different path. By stimulating domestic production, Paris approved a 11,400 million euro 0 cents subsidy package to support French manufacturers of electric and hybrid vehicles. But at the same time, a little-known mechanism called the Ecological admission barrier was launched. Under this provision, each imported car was assessed on its own carbon history, from raw material extraction to final assembly. The result was predictable. The vast majority of American cars, including even some Tesla models, did not pass the 80 CTE, carbon trace emission profile, threshold. This meant an automatic 22% increase in customs duties and a requirement for mandatory adaptation to EU standards. Several large shipments of Ford and Chrysler products were stopped at customs in Le Havre and Rotterdam, and Stellantis representatives publicly expressed concern about the European
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
While Washington was trying to figure out what was going on, European countries were quietly but consistently closing off access to one of the world's most profitable markets for the U.S. And although no country officially called these steps an act of economic warfare, an unofficial term is already circulating in the corridors of the European Parliament: strategy of strangulation through regulation. Moreover, in one of the leaked European Commission documents published by the German newspaper Frankfurter Morgen, there was a phrase that the American side regarded as a challenge. The Americans have accustomed us to their dominance. Now it is time to teach them to adapt. Against the backdrop of this crisis, domestic demand for American cars in the EU fell by 38% compared to the same period last year. And this is not just a decline in sales, it is a real threat of losing not only the market, but also the image of a technological leader. In Germany and France, programs have begun to redistribute market share from car dealerships to auto parts suppliers in favor of local manufacturers. Several large distributors that previously worked with General Motors have announced the suspension of new contracts due to regulatory uncertainty. Meanwhile, Trump, in his usual manner, tried to respond harshly. He declared his readiness to impose mirror tariffs on European cars and to launch an investigation into coordinated actions by EU countries. However, a split emerged within his own administration. Some economic advisors warned that a symmetrical response could only exacerbate the situation. After all, German, French, and even Italian cars still occupy key positions in the US market. Especially in the premium segment, US retaliatory measures could trigger price increases, hit American consumers, and cause an avalanche of retaliatory sanctions from the EU.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
Normally, Europe continues to talk about the priorities of sustainable development, climate protection, and the transition to a green economy. But in reality, these slogans conceal a tough, technologically savvy, and politically calculated economic shield aimed at protecting its own interests. The US, meanwhile, finds itself playing catch-up. If American manufacturers fail to come up with convincing solutions that meet the new standards in the coming months, Europe could become the first region from which America is effectively squeezed out as a car export. At this stage, no one is laughing at the word paralysis anymore. It is being heard more and more often, and with increasing seriousness. While Europe has been confidently pushing its agenda of sustainable development, environmental standards, and technological dominance, the American auto industry has found itself in a position that seemed impossible just a short time ago, in a state of panic-driven restructuring. Companies that had relied for decades on powerful engines, size, and the domestic market suddenly realized that they could no longer ignore the outside world, especially Europe. It suddenly and painfully became clear that what had been the pride of the American auto industry yesterday had become its main weakness today. At an emergency meeting in Detroit, which was not covered by the press, the head of one of the largest US car manufacturers stated bluntly that Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, the American division, were losing competitiveness every month. According to him, the situation has deteriorated to such an extent that factories that previously worked for export to the EU are now forced to either reorient themselves to the domestic market or simply reduce production volume. One of GM's R&D executives admitted in a small circle that at least 70% of models do not meet current EU emission standards, and the situation is unlikely to change in the next 2 years, given the depth of the lag and the need for a complete overhaul of production chains.
There's been a lot of on and off some inconsistency?
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
A real conflict of interests has begun within the US itself. On the one hand, there are car manufacturers demanding that the authorities either adopt European standards or provide full subsidies for re-equipping factories. On the other hand, there is the political elite, in particular Republicans, who categorically refuse to recognize the imposition of foreign standards. Senator Ted Wallace, who is close to Trump, has publicly stated, "America will not dance to Brussels' tune." At the same time, data from the US Department of Commerce showed that car exports to the EU in the first quarter of 2025 fell by 46% compared to the same period in 2024. The panic reached such a level that major auto parts suppliers began looking for new partners outside Europe. Some even shut down production in Ohio and Indiana. The Metaltech Components plant, which supplied exhaust systems for GM models, cut half of its workforce. A representative of the plant's labor union said, "We are losing our jobs, not because we are doing a bad job, but because someone at the top underestimated how quickly Europe could close its doors to us." Against this backdrop, political chaos grew. The Republican Party accused the Democrats of inaction and misunderstanding the international threat. The Democrats, in turn, criticized Trump for his reckless aggression toward allies. In one speech, former Vice President John Lawrence said, "When you start a trade war, you have to understand that your opponent may be technologically prepared, and if you quarrel with Europe, you better have a plan B in your pocket." We don't. All these events coincided with an extremely painful realization for Washington. The environment is no longer just a social agenda. It has become a tool of global political competition. Europe is using climate rhetoric not only to protect the environment, but also to shift the center of economic gravity from America to itself. The new term ecological sovereignty, actively promoted in Brussels, implies complete independence from countries that do not follow the EU's climate strategy, and the US is already on that list. American auto giants are caught between an outdated production model and a new reality where it's not about who has the most powerful engine, but who has the smallest carbon footprint. They're rushing to create new platforms and invest billions in technologies that their leaders were talking about as secondary just yesterday. Tesla, the only company capable of competing in Europe, is turning into an isolated case rather than a reflection of the entire industry. The rest are stalling. It is at this point that Trump's rhetoric begins to lose its persuasiveness. His usual accusations against the EU, "They are cheating us, we are losing billions because of them," no longer sound like a strategy. They sound like an admission of defeat. Europe is acting quickly, in a coordinated and tough manner. And what until recently seemed like an economic misunderstanding is now showing signs of a profound structural shift in the global balance. The American auto industry, accustomed to winning with volume, power, and history, finds itself playing catch-up for the first time in 50 years. And if it fails to adapt in the next 3 to 5 years, Europe may be just the first in a series of lost positions. And Donald Trump, who sought to restore America's economic greatness, will become the president under whom the country began to lose the battle for a key industry, not on the battlefield, but in ports, bureaucratic commissions, and emissions certification laboratories. When the question of further steps was on the agenda, the American automotive industry was faced with a painful choice that could not be postponed. There were not many options. Either urgently adapt to new European requirements, investing billions in restructuring the entire production cycle, or leave Europe, one of the most profitable export markets, and try to gain a foothold in Asia, Latin America, and the domestic market. But even such plans seem shaky, because time, which until recently seemed to be on the US's side, is now working against it. European regulators have not simply tightened regulations, They have created a political and economic atmosphere in which the American auto industry is no longer a welcome player. But the most alarming aspect of this situation is the profound, almost irreversible transformation of the very logic of the automotive industry. In the past, the winner was the one who could make bigger and more powerful cars. Now, the winner is the one who can make cleaner and quieter cars. If the American industry fails to adapt to this model, it risks losing not only Europe, but also Japan, South Korea, Canada, and even large cities within the US. It's New York, San Francisco, and Seattle are already discussing measures to restrict the registration of internal combustion engine vehicles. And California plans to ban their sale by 2035. All this suggests that the European blow was not just unexpected, it was timely because it struck at a moment when the US was not yet ready for systemic change. For Trump, this is not just a foreign policy surprise, but a symbolic defeat. His administration has relied on pressure, ultimatums, and threats. But in reality, it has been met with cold, calculated, and strategically planned resistance. Europe has shown that it is possible to be an ally of the US in NATO while pursuing policies that bring American exports to their knees. This is no longer just an economic dispute, it is a demonstration of a new balance of power. The future remains uncertain. Perhaps the parties will sit down at the negotiating table and find a compromise. Perhaps American manufacturers will be able to rapidly accelerate the transition to electrification and regain their position. Or perhaps we are witnessing the beginning of a systemic shift that will result in the US losing its leadership in a key sector of the global economy for the first time in a century. If so, Trump's current confusion is not the end of the story, but only its first act.